Bom, então eu passo agora a apresentação do professor Peter Evans, chamo ele para, finalmente, a nossa conferência esperada. Ele é o Eleazar Professor of International Studies e é também professor de Sociologia na Universidade da Califórnia, em Berkeley. Ele tem trabalhado sistematicamente sobre o Global South, sobre países em desenvolvimento e sobre o Double Divide, ou seja, as diferenças sistemáticas entre Norte e Sul. São vários livros publicados, vários artigos. O professor Peter Evans tem sido um assíduo, tem estado aqui na Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, no Instituto de Economia, em várias ocasiões, né? Ele faz parte, assim, de uma tradição, também pesquisador, colaborador, membro do MIND, de tal maneira que eu chamo aqui para a sua conferência.
Então, é um grande prazer estar mais uma vez no Rio e eu queria agradecer aos organizadores pelo convite e também pelo trabalho impressionante de organizar esse seminário. Eu vou falar em inglês, todos os slides são em inglês, então eu vou falar em inglês, mas no período de debate, as perguntas em português estão completamente bem-vindos.
A tradução simultânea, viu? Quem precisar, os fones estão atrás, por favor.
So, today, I'm going to start from 3 points of departure. First, as Ana Célia indicated, the current global conjuncture, I think we agree, offers new space for politics and policy in countries like Brazil. Second, new space, new options involves making choices. No space, you don't have to worry about choices. Space, you need to worry about choices. And third, regardless of which choices are made, success will depend fundamentally on reconfiguring the state and its relation to society. In this talk, I'm going to attempt to follow the epistemological advice of Albert Hirschman. Albert, I think, always had one of the most attractive and heuristically valuable visions of how one should do social science. And this quote I like particularly. He said, "We must defend the right to a non-projected future as one of the truly inalienable rights of every person and nation. And we must set the stage for conceptions of change to which the inventiveness of history and a passion for the possible are admitted as vital actors." Okay, so that's the sort of backdrop in terms of the sort of spirit of this talk. So, after 3 decades at least in which the political and policy space shrunk, we are now entering a period in which that political and policy space expands, I believe, and therefore a moment for the inventiveness of history and a passion for the possible. Policy space is expanding, I believe, because we are in a period of shifting global hegemony. U.S. political, ideological, and economic decline is well underway. I might even say, sadly, too far underway from the point of view of those of us who have to live in the United States. But in any case, at the same time, Chinese or East Asian hegemony is not likely to be fully in place for some time to come. And therefore, we're existing in a period of a global interregnum. That is to say, we are between dominant regimes. Now, such a period in history is a period of instability, of risk, but it's also a period of opportunity, and it's the opportunity that I want to focus on, and perhaps others later on will focus on the risks and the possibilities of downside from instability. Okay, so the opportunity created by U.S. decline is, I think, pretty simple, and that is there is now diminished enforcement of that oppressive set of global rules that we knew as global neoliberalism, and those rules in particular, of course, constrain the role of states in the South. Now, there are stronger versions of the opportunities presented by the current global conjuncture. And one of them, which I call the Barros de Castro thesis, is that the emergence of China as hegemon presents a special opportunity for countries of the global South because of the economic complementarities between China and countries of the global South. And those economic complementarities create a set of opportunities that are independent of and in addition to changes in global rules. There's another even stronger version of the opportunities presented by the current conjuncture, the current shift of global hegemony, and that is what I call the Arrighi conjecture. And this is after Giovanni Arrighi, and I'm just going to read out his little quote here. This is, I should say, not a prediction. It's simply a conjecture, but Arrighi does have at the end of his book, Adam Smith in Beijing, this interesting conjecture in which he suggests that the Chinese East Asian hegemony to come could result in, quote, a commonwealth of civilizations truly respectful of cultural differences, based on, quote, accumulation without dispossession, mobilization of human rather than non-human resources, and government through mass participation in shaping policies. This is clearly an indication of the utopian side of Giovanni's thinking, but I think is a nice complement to the Barros de Castro thesis, which is, of course, more empirically grounded. Okay, so I'm not going to try to talk about these stronger versions. I'm simply going to go on the basis of what is possible given an even minimalist version. Okay? So I'm going to suggest here, and this is obviously a gross oversimplification, but I'm going to suggest that if we're thinking about how to exploit current global opportunities, there are basically two different paths one could think about. One is devising state structures and strategies to increase rates of capital accumulation in the global South. The other is refocusing development strategy on the expansion of human capabilities. The latter choice, I would suggest, offers a possibility of trying to push capitalist economies in the direction of goals more traditionally associated with ideal type versions of socialism. Okay, and so in order to start out provocatively with this seminar, get some debate going, I'm going to focus on option number 2. And what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to talk a little bit about the capability approach, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with already. I'm going to talk then about the convergence between the capability approach and modern growth theory. I'll then go on to look a little bit at the implications of this convergence for the role and structure of the 21st century developmental state. And I will illustrate some of the difficulties and mysteries of translating that theory into practice with a little comparison between Brazil and South Africa. And then finally, I'll conclude with some general reflection. Okay, so SEN's capability approach. Again, grossly simplifying, SEN's capability approach offers us, at least in my view, two very simple, basic propositions. One is a proposition that economists have never disagreed with, even though they have often ignored it, and that is that the overall goal of development is obviously the expansion of people's capabilities to lead the kind of lives they value and have reason to value. Okay? That's, I think, probably now become a proposition that has spread throughout the world, despite it's still continuing to be ignored often. The second proposition that is probably less often emphasized, but I think is equally important, as you will see, is that in order to go from that general goal to specific goals, there is only one mechanism, and that is through information-intensive, thoroughly democratic, deliberative institutions. Technocratic analysis cannot set goals once you buy in to SEN's capability approach. And that's obviously a proposition which has very strong implications if we're going to think about the role of the state. Okay, so it's important, I think, to realize that SEN's capability approach does not stand in some kind of zero-sum relationship to modern economic growth theory. To the contrary, SEN's capability approach actually converges with modern growth theory. By focusing attention on human capabilities, SEN also focuses attention on what is more conventionally called human capital, obviously only a subset of capabilities, but an important subset in terms of growth. And in a world where growth is increasingly knowledge-based, as is one of the premises of the mind's operation here, in a world where growth is increasingly knowledge-based, then expanding human capabilities becomes not just a goal of development, but also a key means of development, a key means of increasing productivity and therefore long-run income growth. Okay, now these are just a couple of little quotes, one from a rather prominent econometrician who focuses on education and ideas as a source of growth. And then we come to the other part of the new growth theory, which is that the new growth theory is a little bit more skeptical than old-fashioned growth theory was of how important the role of capital accumulation is in income growth. Okay. So where do we get from this little convergence? We get very quickly to the idea that investing in human capabilities is in fact likely to produce higher growth rates than investing in machines. Okay? The return from physical capital, plant, and equipment is almost universally acknowledged as much lower than the return from investing in human capabilities and the ideas that come out of human heads. Also worth noting that a human capabilities-focused growth strategy is first more likely to be labor-absorbing, pretty important in a world in which growing unemployment or marginal employment is a central problem. It's also less likely to be import-intensive, and finally, it's likely to have a lighter ecological footprint. And I'm happy to go over in much more detail the ways in which a capability-focused growth strategy is likely to have those effects. For now, I'm simply going to focus on the labor-absorbing element, which I think is very important. So, Sen and the endogenous growth theorists, or the new growth theory, then have this nice symbiotic relationship between growth and a focus on capabilities, right? Let's look a minute at the labor-absorbing aspects. Capabilities depend on what? They depend on capability-expanding services, which are, for the most part, interpersonal services and which are, therefore, extremely labor-intensive kinds of services. And anybody who has raised kids knows just how labor-intensive it is to expand human capabilities. So, the capability approach, then, is not only important as a means of growth, but it is also important because capability-expanding services are a major locus of employment. Okay, so we get then three little conclusions here. One is this convergence between capability expansion and accelerating income growth. Second is the connection between the unmet demand in capability expanding services and current problems of inadequate opportunities for employment. And then finally, of course, it flows from this analysis that this model of development is inescapably more state-centric. Inescapably more state-centric. And we'll go on to talk a little bit about why it's inescapably more state-centric. But for starters, it's clear that the expansion of human capabilities is much more a public goods sort of provision than it is a provision of the kind of goods that work most effectively in markets. Okay, so let's look then at the implications of this convergence between the capability approach and growth theory for state-society relations and for the kinds of state capacity that seems most important in this model. Okay, first of all, we have to remind ourselves once again of the political side of the capability approach, okay? Income growth has the nice feature of being the one homogeneous good thing, as Sen calls it. Once you give up that one homogeneous good thing and replace it with the variegated and complex combination of things that go into expanding capabilities, you then, as I said earlier, you then have to abandon the possibility of making a simple technocratic calculation of what goals you're going to go for beyond the most general level. And obviously, that creates problems for the state. And so we have this interesting contradiction here that this is, on the one hand, a much more state-centric vision of what is necessary to propel development, and on the other hand is a vision that is problematic for traditional forms of state organization. Once you focus on a capability expansion approach to development, it also draws attention to the fact that what I'm calling here democratic embeddedness is not only essential in terms of defining goals, but it is also very important, again, as a means of efficient development. Okay? Democratic deliberative decisions are useful in terms of forcing transparency and accountability, especially important, obviously, as goals become more complex. They also are essential in providing that information about social preferences, which is going to increase the return, especially on public investments. Now, this capability approach also has rather strong implications for state-society relations. If one was focusing simply on the accumulation of capital, the possibility of relying on an alliance between the state and capital is obviously a central element in the strategy. If one is focusing on the expansion of capabilities as a means of development, then facilitating the emergence of a modern capitalist class is no longer sufficient, because even modern capitalists can't be relied on to invest at optimal levels in human capabilities. Certainly can't be relied on to invest in those capabilities beyond that small set that is most immediately relevant to profitability. The social returns, the fact that the social returns to capabilities are much higher than the private returns obviously leads to this problem of underinvestment insofar as you're relying on capitalists. On the other hand, if you take a capability expanding approach to development, that means, as we've just discussed in the previous slides, that means that you must develop a much more, what I call, encompassing set of embeddedness. That is to say, a kind of embeddedness that more penetrates civil society as a whole. And this is both because of the problem of goals not being technocratically determined that we talked about before, and also because of the fact that capability expanding services are co-produced by the people who receive them. And Elinor Ostrom, I was very pleased to see Elinor Ostrom get the Nobel Prize, since her idea of co-production fits in so nicely to this analysis. Okay. Now, what about state capacity? What about the organizational capacity of the state? First of all, it should be clear already that this strategy demands a bureaucratic competence and coherence greater than that required of a more traditional 20th century project of industrialization. Okay, and I won't review the steps in that argument, but I think it's pretty clear why this more state-centric, more diffuse, goal-oriented strategy is going to demand a great deal of bureaucratic competence and coherence. At the same time, however, the political side of the capability approach makes it clear that traditional hierarchical methods are less likely to be effective. They will not secure the necessary kind of information. They will not be able to facilitate co-production, etc. Okay? So we have, therefore, this contradiction that I mentioned before, a contradiction in that the demands on the state apparatus increase, at the same time that the modes of operation that a good bureaucrat is used to engaging in become less effective. So it is indeed a strategy which focuses our attention on the state, but also which makes it harder for states to succeed. So maybe you may say it's too hard. Maybe it's a strategy that simply goes beyond the passion for the possible. Maybe it's a utopian strategy, and we will come back to that in a moment. However, first, I would like to just do a little tiny empirical exercise just to illustrate that this strategy is not only hard for the state to accomplish, it's even difficult to figure out why the state fails to accomplish it. And in order to illustrate this, I'm going to do a quick comparison between Brazil and South Africa on some indicators that are clearly indicative of capability expansion. And of course, Brazil, and these particular numbers are simply illustrative. They come from a new book by Evan Lieberman, which is worth looking at. But in any case, the point here of this slide is simply that Brazil and South Africa are an interesting point of comparison. They're both middle-income countries, roughly similar in terms of GDP per capita. South Africa is, of course, a little smaller. They are also countries that historically have been characterized by among the highest rates of inequality in the world. And finally, of course, if you look at these two countries over the course of the last 15, 20 years, they are both countries that have become more democratic. Okay, so what do we see when we look at performance in terms of capability-related indicators? First of all, we see that Brazil, which starts out with higher infant mortality, ends up with dramatically lower infant mortality than South Africa. I know some of you out there thinking, well, this is simply an AIDS effect. We'll get back to that. Same thing if we look at net primary school enrollments, looking at women in particular. South Africa starts out way ahead of Brazil in 1991, ends up behind Brazil by the current period. If we try to put these things together and look at the Human Development Index, we see a divergence of Brazil and South Africa starting in 1995, which is, of course, precisely the same time that the new ANC government comes into power. Likewise, we see a divergence in terms of inequality. While Brazil's historic leadership in terms of global inequality diminishes slightly over the last 10, 15 years, South Africa's historic leadership in terms of inequality increases quite dramatically given its already high levels, despite the formal abolition of apartheid. Okay, now these are not results that are explicable at all in terms of growth. If we look at growth in Brazil, growth in South Africa, we notice that in the prior period to the one we're focusing on here, growth in Brazil is a little higher than South Africa, but in fact, in the period from 1995 to the present, growth in South Africa is actually higher than in Brazil. So none of these results can be attributed to some kind of failure of capital accumulation in South Africa. If you look at the actual annual rates of growth, you see they jump around a lot, and if you look at this chart a little bit more closely, you'll see that both countries seem to jump around primarily in response to what's happening in the global economy, and there is no obvious divergence in terms of growth. Okay, so why do we have these diverging capability trajectories? It's not just AIDS. AIDS is endogenous to this story, because one of the reasons that Brazil has a good performance on health indicators is that Brazil is one of the countries that, starting in the late 80s, was exceptionally effective in terms of combating the AIDS epidemic. It's also probably not the case that this divergence in terms of capability expansion is attributable to a lack of administrative capacity on the part of the South African state. South Africa has indeed one of the most effective state apparatuses in the global South. And if any of you have been there and checked out South African infrastructure and so on, I think you'll agree that the performance of the South African state in traditional terms is quite exceptional in terms of the global South. Now, what does that leave? Well, that leaves this important area that I was talking about before, state-civil society relations. And I'm just throwing this out as a hypothesis right now, but let me just give you a 30-second summary of what I call the Heller thesis, after Patrick Heller, who's been working on South Africa for a while now. And what Heller suggests is that, ironically, the ANC government, having come to power on the basis of popular struggle, has, in part as a result of its political monopoly on power, devolved into a party state that relies way too heavily on traditional top-down bureaucratic means and is therefore incapable of engaging civil society in the co-production of those services that it would need in order to deliver the capability expansion that Brazil has delivered. I'm not saying here, mind you, that Brazil's capability expansion is everything that one could hope for. All of you who live in Brazil are aware that Brazil's capacity at capability expansion is far from the ideal. But nonetheless, it is the case that Brazil's performance is something to be longed for if you're looking at it from the perspective of South Africa. And so, what is the bottom line here? The bottom line is that the kinds of state capacities required for capability expansion are a little bit harder to figure out than the traditional bureaucratic state capacities that we're used to thinking about in terms of developmental states. These ways of relating effectively to civil society that facilitate and stimulate the co-production of capability expanding services are a little bit less analyzed, a little bit less understood than those traditional capacities. And so this is simply a way of underlining again the fact that the capability approach both puts heavier demands on the state and at the same time creates greater difficulties for the state in terms of satisfying those demands. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, it would be nice if I had a snappy solution to this contradiction. It would be nice if I had a formula as to how one can transform the state to provide a capability expanding developmental state. Unfortunately, the problem I'm talking about are problems that I share rather than problems to which I've managed to produce a solution. So, first of all, let me introduce an obvious caveat here, and that is I have been focusing on my option number 2, and I've been doing that, as I say, for purposes of provocation. But I do want to underline that focusing on capability expansion should not be taken as an excuse for simply ignoring industrial policy. Because just as capability expansion is also a growth strategy, a carefully conceived capital accumulation strategy should also be a carefully conceived capital accumulation strategy should also be a capability expansion strategy. And I think one of the best examples of that is Ken Shadlin. You could raise your hand, Ken. Is Ken Shadlin's work on the role of industrial policy in pharmaceuticals and its eventual contribution to shifting political strategies in relation to AIDS drugs, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about that later on in the seminar. But the point here is that if you're prioritizing capability expansion, then the trick of a capital accumulation strategy is not to let it become simply a strategy which empowers capitalists to pursue their own short-term interests. Okay. Now, second, let me make an assertion, and that is that the fact that a capability expanding state stands at the frontiers of what one can incorporate within a passion for the possible, stands perhaps at the boundary lines between that which is a goal consistent with the passion for the possible and that which might be considered utopian. Despite that fact, I would argue that a capability expanding state is a task that is unavoidable, and that if one tries to avoid that task, one ends up precisely where the United States is ending up currently, and that if one is in the global south, the problems generated by trying to avoid that task are even greater and more immediate. So I'm just going to make that assertion there, and perhaps somebody will like to contest that assertion in the discussion. Okay? So, is my assertion correct? Maybe, maybe not. And hopefully in 3 days, by Friday afternoon, it will be clear what the answer to this question is. In the meantime, I would suggest that we can agree on at least 3 things. The first thing that I think we can all agree on, that's going to be outside of the realm of debate, is that it would obviously be a great shame to miss the opportunity presented to states of the global south in particular by the current global conjuncture. Secondly, I think we can all agree that taking advantage of this opportunity means leveraging our knowledge to explore new developmental strategies. Now, we may disagree on exactly what form these new strategies will take, but I think we can agree that if there's an opportunity, it should be the response to that opportunity should be innovation, not just in technological terms, but in policy and political terms as well. And finally, I think we will all agree that while translating theory into practice isn't easy, theoretically informed choices are the sine qua non of creating a 21st century developmental project. Thank you.
Estamos aqui ainda recuperando da maravilhosa conferência do professor Evans, que vai além dos três textos enviados que estão no site. E eu penso, então, que agora podemos iniciar o debate. Jaguaribe, quer começar? Aqui, ó, tem a... Isso. Léo. Isso.
Bom, em primeiro lugar, eu queria agradecer muito ao professor Evans por essa apresentação. Eu não estou no meu cotidiano no mundo acadêmico, é extremamente refrescante e estimulante poder, então, se confrontar com ideias inovadoras e criativas a respeito da situação internacional. Eu achei muito interessante, bem colocada todas as questões. Apenas uma dúvida, porque essa questão de encontrar paralelos em exemplos práticos e o caso comparativo da África do Sul com o Brasil me deixa um pouco intrigado, porque a África do Sul passa por um processo muito convulsionado chamado empoderamento negro. E é um processo que tem ineficácia administrativa, embora seja de evidente demanda social. E esse período da comparação é exatamente o processo em que se dá esse grande passo do empoderamento negro, fundamental num país como a África do Sul, para criar um equilíbrio social, uma integração social plena e, evidentemente, com entendível, compreensível perda de eficácia administrativa.
Peter, muito obrigado por mais um brilhante texto e conferência, palestra. Bom, e você pediu um pouco, quer dizer, anunciou que iria provocar, então eu vou responder um pouco também provocando. Seguinte, eu acho que, obviamente, o texto é extremamente original, é em si uma agenda de pesquisa da qual nós partilhamos. Agora, da forma como você organizou o texto, para mim, ficou uma grande questão, ou se você quiser, ficou um big elephant in the room, que é o seguinte: o elefante é ou a China ou o modelo ocidental de democracia. Aí cabe uma escolha. Pelo seguinte, porque logo no início do texto você faz a afirmativa de que active democratic structures are the necessary foundation for effective economic action. Tá? E lá mais tarde no texto, quando você focaliza alguns exemplos sobre como isso vem sendo feito, delivery of collective goods, etc., tanto você usa o ARIG e você usa o SEN, e todos estão falando da China como o lugar onde isso tem sido feito com muito sucesso. No sentido de que a China tem desempenhado essa função de maneira... A China aparece como a estrela no texto e não qualquer outro país que seria considerado democrático. Então, o elefante entra na sala, a meu juízo, aí. Porque se o engajamento democrático, deliberação democrática, engajamento com a sociedade civil são condições sine qua non, então, como é que a China é a estrela da história? Ou será que na China há uma conversa sobre direitos humanos, há uma conversa sobre, digamos, democracia no sentido econômico da palavra, de tirar cada vez mais massas da linha de pobreza, etc. Mas, quando se fala em democracia e China, todo mundo torce o nariz, porque diz, não, democracia é Estados Unidos, democracia é Europa, e a China é alguma coisa que nada tem a ver com a democracia. Então, bom, a pergunta que fica é, você partilha da ideia de que a China e a democracia não tem nada a ver, uma coisa a ver com a outra? Se você partilha, então por que a China é a grande estrela aqui em termos de delivering collective goods, etc, etc? Caso contrário, então, o que fica em questão é a própria noção de democracia e tal, de democracia Western style, porque aí a gente fica com uma tremendo ponto de interrogação, que é a ideia do Sen de democratic deliberation, a sua própria ideia de engagement with civil society. Bom, qual é o modelo para isso? Porque você fez na sua palestra, na sua fala, a comparação África do Sul e Brasil, favorece o Brasil, e você sugeriu, favorece porque o Brasil tem mais condições para fazer esse deliver the capabilities approach, etc. E se a comparação fosse entre Brasil e China, quem se sairia melhor? E se a China se saísse melhor, como é que ficaria a questão da democracia nessa equação? Tá? E só um pé de página para terminar. Trazer essa New Growth Theory para dentro do clube, aí, eu diria que é um pouco perigoso, porque essa história, New Growth Theory, eu acho que é extremamente simplificatória, no sentido de que investimento em educação leva a tudo. Qual é um grande contra-exemplo a isso tudo? Chama-se Brasil. O Brasil, entre 1930 e 80, foi um dos 3 países que cresceram mais rápido no mundo. Se você falar em investimento em educação no Brasil entre 30 e 80, não foi exatamente uma coisa asiática ou sequer próxima disso. Quer dizer, o Brasil cresceu a taxas asiáticas sem uma fração do investimento em educação que a Ásia trouxe, o que para New Growth Theory é um tremendo embaraço. Mas esse é só um pé de página, não é a pergunta. Obrigado.
Na verdade, é um complemento, eu acho, a pergunta do Leonardo. Se essa educação que a gente tem no Brasil não é suficiente, e vários papers têm mostrado isso, né, quais são as novas formas de repensar a educação mais inclusiva, com tecnologia, etc., etc., qual a educação você considera a educação que seria suficiente para esse novo... para essa nova forma de ver a relação Estado-sociedade? Então, eu acho que é um pouco vinculado à pergunta do Leonardo, né? Tem um relatório recente da OECD falando que o Brasil, que a educação tem expandido muito, mas a educação brasileira não é pertinente à inovação, né? Não tem essa ligação entre educação e capacidade de inovação, capacidade tecnológica, né? Então, a gente vê índices de muitos PhDs, mas eles não estão na indústria, eles estão na academia e assim por diante. Então, qual é o papel da educação nesse modelo que o senhor apresenta?
E vou responder em inglês, porque fica mais fácil. As questões são muito difíceis, então eu recorre ao inglês, né? The question of black empowerment in South Africa and its consequences for the efficacy of the state is, I agree, an important one, and one which I don't think we have good data on what the relationship between those two things is. Let me just use, however, the question of black empowerment as a way of introducing another theme which I sort of left out of the presentation, but is also relevant to the answer to Leonardo's question as well. And that is, obviously, we have to think about, in both the Brazilian case and the Chinese case and the South African case, we have to think about the question of what is the relationship of the state to the capitalist class. Okay? Because it's not only civil society which is important here, but also the relationship of the state to the capitalist class. I would argue that peculiarly South Africa ended up, or the ANC party state, ended up having a particularly close relationship to the capitalist class, in part because they felt that the difficulty of securing any loyalty of the capitalist class was great, and in part because the South African regime essentially bought, or at least the Mbeki regime essentially bought, a neoliberal model of development which suggested that the alliance with the capitalist class was the sine qua non of their success in development. In consequence, and we can have an argument about this, but in consequence, I believe that the ANC state ignored low-hanging fruit in terms of state revenues that would have been fundamental in terms of reversing the declining capabilities, expansion capacity that they had. Those low-hanging fruits, to me, are the obvious revenues from the primary resource exporters, who are primarily not just a white capitalist class, but a foreign capitalist class. The South African state was very loath to impose the taxes on those groups, which those groups, I believe, would have been happy to pay if imposed, and which those groups could not have avoided in any case because the resources weren't going to move. Okay, so that's an example of the way in which I think looking at the role of the South African state, we have to look at it not just in terms of its relation to civil society, which I would continue to contend is a problem of a party state too interested in maintaining its power and not enough interested in figuring out new ways of delivering services. But we also have to consider its relation to the capitalist class and the ways in which that relationship distorted strategy. Right? Now, I'm not denying that there may have been problems in terms of maintaining bureaucratic capacity while shifting personnel, but I think those problems probably don't account for the results that we've seen. Though that shift was reasonably gradual, and remember, the period of the shift that we've seen starts right from the moment the ANC government takes over. Unlikely that you can attribute changes as rapidly as the ones we've seen to a shift in bureaucratic capacity. My guess is that shifts in bureaucratic capacity take a little bit longer lead time to appear in the outcome statistics than the ones that we're talking about. Okay, and on to Leonardo's very astute focusing on the question of China. Right? To start out with, I would simply, in a sense, repeat what I just said with regard to South Africa. And that is, we have to start out looking at the Chinese state in terms of its relation to dominant economic groups. In the case of China, important, obviously, are agrarian landholders as well as capitalists. Okay? If we start from that perspective, of course, where do we start? We start with Communist China having wiped out agrarian landowners. We start with Communist China having a Gini index of land distribution post-dissolution of the communes of essentially 0. Okay? Now, a Gini index in land distribution of essentially 0 is absolutely unheard of in the global South, outside of China, maybe Cuba, I don't know. But in any case, that is a huge advantage. That is to say, that's a huge advantage that you start out with, because that means that the most important resource to most people, i.e. land, is very equally distributed. And so you get in China a more extreme case of the kind of contrast that you can get if you look at, for example, the difference between Guatemala and Costa Rica, right? If you look at the numbers for Guatemala and Costa Rica, they start out in the 19th century. Guatemala a little bit higher incomes than Costa Rica. By the present, Costa Rica is at least double the income of Guatemala. Why is this? Well, it's in good measure because a more equal distribution of land gives people both the resources and the incentives to invest in their own human capital, and so consequently that contrast has been used as a nice affirmation of a more capability-focused approach. And I think that if you look at land distribution in China, that's an absolutely fundamental element. Okay? Now, second, if we look at the heritage we're talking about in China, we're also talking about a heritage in which China is one of the few countries in the world where you actually have a programmatic party that has an impact on policy. Now, you may see the Chinese Communist Party as simply a traditional top-down organization. I don't think that's quite correct. I think that the Chinese Communist Party, while it does have top-down, indeed authoritarian and repressive roles in the society, also has served as a mechanism for, indeed, collecting information, for facilitating implementation, and so on. So we don't understand how the Chinese Communist Party worked. We probably never will, because it probably doesn't work the same way now as it did for the first 40 years of post-revolutionary China. But certainly it is a form of penetrating civil society. It's a form of knowing what's going on in civil society that is quite different than what we find in other places in the global south. Okay? Third, we have what we could call the Sen hypothesis. Right? Now, Sen points out that the Chinese communist regime invested huge amounts in health and education for a long time, and that those investments were relatively, not completely equally distributed. Obviously, the western regions of China were always disprivileged, but in terms of spreading those investments out to ordinary people, the Chinese communist regime was largely exemplary. Okay? So Sen's argument is, okay, if we look, he likes to use China and India. Okay, that's his favorite comparison. And if we look at China and India, what we find is that Chinese mortality rates fell much more rapidly than those in India through about 1985, maybe 1990. But that in recent years, Chinese mortality rates have ceased to fall more rapidly. Okay, what does that suggest? That suggests that the character of the Chinese state in terms of its investments in widespread capability expansion have changed over the course of the last 20 years. And of course, that change is at least correlates with a new relationship with a new emerging capitalist class in China, and it correlates with what we suspect is probably the atrophy of the Chinese Communist Party as a means of capillary relationships to civil society. Okay? So, finally, let me say that I think your question is excellent in that it does flag the fact that when we use the term democratic deliberation, it's easy for those of us who are used to conflating democracy with periodic electoral contest to have a hard time figuring out other forms which democratic deliberation might take. Okay, and so I think one of the agendas that this developmental strategy suggests is that it's an agenda which forces us to look much more seriously at the question of what kinds of institutional forms, in fact, are most effective in terms of allowing civil society to communicate social preferences and in terms of getting some kind of downward accountability in terms of the allocation of resources. In fact, you're probably familiar with a book by Lily Tsai on the forms of local politics in China, where she characterizes it as downward accountability without democracy. And of course, she's using democracy to mean electoral democracy in that sense. Now, I'm not saying that I've escaped your critique here. I think that one can make a valid critique of this program, looking at the question of Chinese politics. I'm just saying that critique is not quite as clear as one might hope it would be, and that it does depend on how you look at the historical case of China and at the evolution of China's politics as well as policy over the course of the last 40, 50 years. And then finally, Carolina, the question of what kind of education are we talking about here in terms of, what would we want out of Brazil, given that Brazil is already, producing these very highly qualified individuals, and that the problem seems to be a lack of opportunity for them to actually utilize the capabilities that they have. Obviously, one of the tricky things about the way that I have brought together new growth theory and the capability approach is that I am quietly fusing those kind of specialized capabilities that are particularly relevant to questions of leading edge innovation, etc., with the much more generalized capabilities that are essential in terms of the overall productivity of the population, and indeed in terms of the capacity of the population to participate in exactly the kinds of democratic deliberation that we're talking about. And I would agree with you that the kinds of strategies that are required in order to maximize the return from that very specialized kind of set of capabilities that are most related to the innovation frontier are quite different from and require an independent analysis from the kinds of capabilities that are, more focused on the capabilities of the population at large, okay? And so basically, while I have been making a connection here, which I think is a valid connection overall, I haven't been focused on this leading edge kind of innovative capability, in part because I think there's a lot of papers to come in the next 3 days that focus more on that part. I will say, though, just 3 reasons for my focus more on the question of broad capabilities in terms of this analysis. And the first point is, of course, insofar as one is concerned with capabilities not just as a means, but also as a goal, then clearly it is the broad-based capabilities that are the most sort of weighty and telling, right? In other words, the expansion of the capabilities of the broad base of the population has a huge impact in terms of people's, as Sen says, ability to lead the lives they value and have reason to value, right? So that's one point. The second point is this point with regard to capability expanding services. And that is that capabilities as means, that is to say, the expansion of capabilities as means, insofar as it implies, at least in part, this expansion of broad-based general capabilities, also implies the improvement of working conditions and returns in those segments of employment that are involved in producing those capabilities. And that happens to be a very large and growing segment of total employment. And so capabilities not only enters into well-being as a sort of overall overarching general goal, but also enters into well-being in the sense that an improvement of returns to those engaged in capability expanding services not only has long-term implications in terms of growth, but also has immediate implications in terms of the well-being of those people employed in those services, which, as I say, is a growing segment of the population overall. Okay, so I agree with you that the particular issue of the relationship between capability expansion at the frontier and innovation and growth is something that I haven't done properly in this paper, but hopefully others will fill in that gap before we're through.
Professor, também quero compartilhar aí do agradecimento de todos pela palestra brilhante, pelos papers que tivemos a oportunidade de ler também. Uma dúvida que me ocorreu ao ler o texto é basicamente o seguinte. Em formulações anteriores, o senhor colocava que uma burocracia weberiana bem montada, né, combinada com a articulação com o empresariado, era uma condição básica para promover um desenvolvimento centrado na acumulação de capital. Nesse novo modelo de desenvolvimento centrado na expansão das capabilidades, a articulação com a sociedade tem que envolver outros atores, mas qual que é o impacto que isso poderia trazer para a organização da própria burocracia do Estado? Essa é a minha dúvida.
Meu nome é Cláudia.
Cláudia. Depois você passa para a Liliana.
Eu queria fazer uma pergunta sobre essa questão das instituições, que me parece super importante. Quando você pega o caso do Brasil, me parece que uma das dificuldades de fazer política industrial é que, os que estão dentro do Estado sempre são assediados por milhares de grupos de lobby que também querem ser beneficiados por uma política industrial estatal. Então, o argumento dos liberais, dos neoliberais, é o seguinte: com o Estado, com a democracia que a gente tem, que não é uma democracia deliberativa, no sentido que o SEM usa, é uma democracia muito mais espelhada no modelo americano, com a única diferença que aqui os lobbies não são legalizados. Então, o argumento da direita é sempre assim: você começa a dar privilégio ou estimular algum determinado setor e daqui a pouco o Estado está bancando todos os setores. Então, isso é um argumento que já se vê muito no debate brasileiro. Então, isso é uma questão. Como você fazer essa transição sem ter um mínimo nível de consenso político e tendo eleição de 4 em 4 anos, certo? Porque acho que ninguém vai acabar com a eleição de 4 em 4 anos. Então, essa é outra questão. Outra questão que eu queria perguntar é se a gente, quando você fala de um modelo de aumento da capacidade, e, obviamente, todos os focos hoje em dia estão na Ásia, mas eu fico me perguntando se o modelo que melhor conseguiu levar um pouco isso adiante não é a democracia, a social-democracia clássica europeia, se não é nos países europeus, inclusive nessa questão da expansão dos serviços para, enfim, para serviço de cuidar de criança, de cuidar de velho, de não sei o quê. E por que que esse modelo da velha e clássica social-democracia europeia seria inviável do ponto de vista, ou não, estou perguntando isso, do ponto de vista desse momento que o mundo está passando e até do ponto de vista brasileiro, né, dos países do Sul. Então, na verdade, são um pouco duas perguntas.
Hi, I'm going to speak English because it's easier for me. I liked your papers very much. I just wanted to make one comment. I was very glad now you expanded the idea of human capabilities. But I'm a bit uneasy with the idea of polarizing, you know, between the innovation-related capabilities and the broad-based ones, especially because if you're following parts of Sen's argument, it's this idea that it's organizational skills and power, decision-making processes based on power for different social sectors, which is important to engage them in your own approach of inclusion in the state-society relationships. So I would say, for example, taking some examples of some of the things that are happening in Europe now, like consultation making about new technologies, like the ones I'm interested in, like stem cells or whatever, the cutting-edge innovation where people are coming in different interest groups with much more participation. So I would like your comment on that, because if not, if it becomes polarized, then you have like two sources, which is what I feel is happening in Brazil now, towards a lot of investment in innovation, but disrelated from the other groups. That was the first thing. And the second quick thing is that I would make the point also that in South Africa, are you there? That in South Africa there was this the complete difference is that they had to build a new class, build a new capitalist class, and that new capitalist class conflagrated too much with the state and with the NC. What Elio Hawarivi said about the empowerment groups, those new capitalists or new entrepreneurs were almost part of the state. So there's a big difference there to compare with Brazil, no? Okay.
Obrigada. Em primeiro lugar, agradecer ao professor Evans, realmente muito interessante todos os pontos que ele falou. Eu queria só complementar com duas coisas. Me parece que uma das coisas interessantes que ele colocou é exatamente essa, ou seja, nós estamos enfrentando um desafio, existe uma possibilidade, e qual é exatamente a natureza desse desafio que os países emergentes podem confrontar-se ou não na tentativa de um novo modelo de crescimento. E aí, eu acho que duas coisas são importantes. Primeiro, é o que está aparentemente, vamos dizer, por debaixo de todas as considerações, é que nós voltamos a ter uma espécie de centralidade da cultura, novamente, a cultura lato sensu, seja ela conhecimento, knowledge government, o que seja, dentro da problemática do desenvolvimento. De uma certa forma, quase como isso existiu num certo período do século XIX. Quer dizer, é um retorno, novamente, ao que são os passamares da sociedade do conhecimento. A segunda coisa que eu acho importante é que existe talvez uma falsa contradição entre a acumulação e capacitação, porque o que é realmente interessante é o Estado hoje, não é mais o problema se o Estado está ou não ligado com as classes empresariais ou capitalistas, ou seja, o Estado, e sobretudo o Estado que nós estamos falando, é um Estado de posses. Então, se trata de saber como é que esse Estado vai poder administrar os bens que já tem de uma forma a enfrentar esse novo desafio da capacitação. E com relação a isso, eu acho que o debate sobre a China é fundamental, porque uma coisa é dizer o que é um governo democrático, uma outra coisa é o que é a criação de uma sociedade democrática. Eu acho que todas as discussões sobre a China hoje são precisamente essas, ou seja, o dilema, e o que a China tem a ensinar é isso. E uma das características, ensinar do ponto de vista que esse é o grande debate que agora ocorre, e uma das características do governo chinês é exatamente a centralidade da ideia de cultura como patamar do desenvolvimento. E aqui eu lembro um trabalho pouco conhecido aqui no Brasil, mas eu acho muito interessante, do professor Cui Ji-wan, que levanta a ideia de que o novo patamar para os países emergentes, para os países pós-comunistas, é precisamente a ideia do liberal socialismo, de como é que o novo pacto entre Estado e capital, entre capital e trabalho, deve ir além da social-democracia tradicional, porque não se trata mais de pactos corporativistas, mas sim de uma nova capacitação do Estado, um novo patamar de possibilidades do Estado com relação à cultura e à capacitação da sociedade em geral. Esse debate, eu acho que é o debate de hoje, é o debate interessante, e queria colocar esses.
Okay. First, in response to Inacio's question, I would say that you went directly to the heart of the problem that I see. In other words, that indeed, taking a capability expansion approach represents a sort of alien challenge to exactly the structures that I at least associate with the success, the developmental success, at least of the East Asian 20th century developmental state. And so that you've got precisely the contradiction that I think is perhaps most crucial here, and one that I have to admit I haven't yet figured a way out of, and I think that figuring a way out of it requires not just thinking more about the state, but also thinking more about the character of civil society and what is necessary in order to create the interlocutors on the side of civil society who will be effective parceiros for a capability expanding state. And you know, a while back I did a little book on state-society synergy, which was an initial foray into trying to figure that out. But I have to admit, I think that's a completely central question, and perhaps a little bit of the kind of networks and interaction that Liliana was talking about in terms of European innovation. In that, in respect to that, may be interesting to look at as analogies, if not as models. Okay, with respect to Claudia's question of whether we want to return to the to classic models of democracy, I'm suspicious of trying to return to classic models of democracy, primarily because I think our experience, not only in the Global South, but also in the Global North, but perhaps particularly in the Global South, our experience in trying to implant classic democratic models has been that they tend to result in a hollowed out democracy. That is to say, in a democracy, to use the term of Adam Jaworski, in a democracy where people can vote but they can't choose. That is to say, the kind of party competition that one gets in a classic democratic model in an epoch in which electronic communication, particularly television, dominates the competitiveness of different parties, and in which television is extremely expensive. And I think Brazil deserves some credit for having at least tried to attack that problem, but that for the most part, it's extremely difficult to actually get a classic democracy that gives people choices. And the institutional infrastructure for doing that is, I think, very hard to recuperate. And we could, you know, that's a whole other kind of discussion, I think, trying to figure that out. Obviously, your first comment about the extent to which the allocative institutions of the state end up dominated by lobbies, et cetera, and so that you don't get anything that one would consider even close to deliberative decision making. You know, that's completely correct. The question is, what's the strategy for combating that? And I'm not sure that a sort of classical democratic model does that. In terms of getting back to Liliana, I think that yeah, perhaps I fell into too much of a dichotomy between the innovation, cutting-edge kinds of capabilities and the more broad-based kind of capabilities. And I think you're also correct that one of the reasons why one doesn't want to make that separation is because capabilities also have implications for power. And this is, of course, a weakness of Sen's analysis, right? Sen appears blissfully innocent of questions of power when he talks about democratic deliberation. And that's, you know, that's definitely something which needs to be incorporated into any sort of revision of the Senian analysis. In terms of South Africa building a new capitalist class, I would say that South Africa, what has gone on is not really building a new capitalist class. What has gone on is the co-optation of a political elite into a very traditional capitalist class, and that is part of the core of the problem that I was talking about before. And I would argue that the fact that when you try to focus on capitalist accumulation and when you see your goal as sort of participating in that process of capitalist accumulation, you end up in the kind of weird position that the ANC regime has found itself of, despite having huge political power, being completely unable to really shift the priorities and strategies of that new amalgamated capitalist class. So I think, again, it's a key issue in terms of that particular case. Who am I missing here? I'm missing somebody. Oh, no? Ah! No. Ah, Taki. Yes. The issue of how we sort of reintegrate culture into our analysis of development, that's a really tough one. I think that's, of all the tough questions that have been raised so far, that's the one in which I feel most out of my depth, because I really feel like culture is something that I don't quite understand.
Knowledge. No, knowledge is
Knowledge is a little easier, maybe. But even so, I mean, I like these ideas of sort of liberating socialism from old ideas and going beyond traditional democratic socialism and so on. But I'm not sure I'm ready to make a cogent contribution to that debate right now.
Sobre democracia, achei interessante esse ponto, né, que você levanta sobre a importância da relação entre
repete, por favor.
About democracy.
Sim.
O ponto que você levanta a questão da importância da relação entre o Estado e a sociedade civil, né, que eu acho que quer dizer, um ponto muito forte na sua própria contribuição teórica que você retoma agora nesse novo approach das capacitações, né. Quando eu li um dos papers que você baseou a sua conferência nele, me chamou a atenção para a ausência da questão da democracia participativa, né? Você chama a atenção para a questão da deliberação, que eu acho que é um tema que está muito presente, né, na análise do Sen, ainda que ele não faça referência aos teóricos, né, da democracia deliberativa, que é já uma literatura grande, que tem, sei lá, que eu saiba, pelo menos uns 20 anos. Não são os temas que estão nessa literatura que eu encontro no próprio Sen, mas faz sentido para mim essa questão da deliberação, né? Mas, assim, no caso brasileiro, chama muito a atenção não só a questão da deliberação, como a questão participativa, né? Quer dizer, eu fico vendo, por exemplo, a experiência dos conselhos, a experiência das conferências, né? Houve uma energia muito grande por parte desse último governo. Acho que é uma coisa que já vem desde os governos anteriores, mas especialmente nesse governo, olhando o número de conferências, por exemplo, nacionais, e vários temas, onde se discutem coisas, mas também a dimensão da participação da sociedade civil, né? Então, a questão da organização dos interlocutores. Então, gostaria de ouvir um pouco de você essa questão da democracia participativa, distintamente da questão da deliberativa.
Bom, Peter, para provocar um pouco mais, então, eu queria te perguntar sobre, quer dizer, nesse novo modelo do desenvolvimento mais baseado nas ideias e menos na matéria, né? Quer dizer, um desenvolvimento mais centrado na educação e enfim, como que fica esse desafio o fato do conhecimento ser um bem comum, né, que pode ser compartilhado, pode ser dividido, como o Paul Homer coloca, né, essa economia das ideias, ela é muito diferente da economia das coisas, né? Enquanto que nós tivemos no Brasil um processo de substituição das importações, né, baseado em uma política protecionista, né, algo que não pode ser feito no caso das ideias, porque elas não têm esse limite fronteiriço, né, e ela pode ser reproduzida. Você não acha que há um risco de se continuar assim numa dependência, seja cultural, seja intelectual, pela incapacidade de competir no campo das ideias?
I think that the question of thinking about democracia participativa instead of simply thinking about deliberative democracy is an extremely important question in terms of trying to ground Sen in a more realistic institutional matrix which he himself, of course, prefers to escape. You know, I was saying that Sen was blissfully innocent of a discussion of power in his discussion of deliberative democracy. He can be blissfully innocent of a discussion of power, and of course, obviously, Sen is not really blissfully innocent. He just chooses to present himself as blissfully innocent. But his apparent blissful innocence in relation to power derives from the fact that underlying Sen's discussion of deliberation is an implicit idea that there is no ultimate zero-sum conflict of interests. And so therefore, if everybody gets together and talks things over, eventually there is a shared interest that can be agreed upon, right? If you take a different assumption, i.e. that there may in fact be fundamental conflicts of interest that must therefore be resolved through relative power, then participative democracy becomes more interesting than deliberative democracy, because participative democracy has the possibility, I think, of incorporating an element of power into the deliberation, so that the deliberation doesn't simply have to result in consensus or the agreement on a shared set of interests, but may in fact result in, okay, everybody's participated in this decision, and here are the interests that will be realized as a result of that decision. And so there is an admitting of power into the question of participation. Therefore, I would agree with you that participation is probably a more interesting way to think about the democratic process than simply deliberation, although deliberation is, I would argue, a sort of a broader term, and so therefore participation is a more institutionally specific version of deliberation. I think it's probably a more interesting one. So I agree completely with your, with your raising that that point, and it would be interesting if Sen were willing to engage in these kind of debates, which he's not, but the rest of us just have to carry on regardless and see where we can get to. Okay, very good, Paulo, because this gives us a chance to raise another kind of issue that didn't come up in the talk today, and that is the question of the appropriation of returns from ideas. Obviously, if growth is knowledge-based, and if the returns from ideas are much greater than the returns from tangible capital, then the question of who gets to appropriate the returns from ideas is absolutely fundamental. And therefore, I would argue that if you take seriously this whole new growth theory returns from ideas model, therefore the struggle, which is one of the central concerns of minds, of course, the struggle over how to define intellectual property rights and what is a reasonable way of dividing the returns from ideas which are in some sense the collective goods produced by 5,000 years of human history. What's a reasonable way to divide those returns is a fundamental question of political economy at the global level. Because obviously the way in which those returns were divided under the neoliberal model was simply that if you were able to claim ownership on the basis of a very narrow-minded definition of who gets to be the owner, then you were the owner and you could get the returns. And that definition obviously is not only prejudicial to all of the countries of the global south, it's also, I would argue, a way of dividing the returns from ideas that is absolutely prejudicial to maximizing the level of innovation, the utilization of ideas, and everything else. You've probably seen this little thing I did on free steam engines versus the second enclosure movement, but I think that question is absolutely fundamental, this development model at the global level, not just at the national level, because obviously it's a question you can't resolve simply at the national level.
Maravilha.